Have you ever felt like your heart was ripped out of your chest and buried 6 feet under? Have you ever stood at a grave talking to cold stone, wishing desperately for just one more conversation, one more hug, one more chance to say, "I love you"? That was my life for 3 years. Every Sunday morning, I'd drive to Riverside Cemetery, park in the same spot under the old oak tree, and walk the familiar path to my daughter's grave, Sarah Ann Morrison, beloved daughter, gone too soon. The words carved into granite never got easier to read. I'd bring fresh flowers, usually sunflowers, because they were her favorite, and I'd sit there on the damp grass talking to her about everything and nothing. I'd tell her about her mother, about how we were managing, about the weather, about the neighbors, about anything that came to mind, because the silence of not speaking to her was worse than the awkwardness of talking to a headstone. But 3 years ago, on a Sunday morning that started like all the others, everything changed. I arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual, around 7 in the morning, because I couldn't sleep. The nightmares had been particularly bad that week. Dreams where Sarah was calling out to me, but I couldn't reach her, couldn't save her. The cemetery was quiet, wrapped in that early morning mist that makes everything look ethereal and otherworldly. I walked my usual path, clutching the sunflowers I'd picked up from the grocery store, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. But as I approached Sarah's grave, I froze. There was someone there, a small figure hunched over, placing something on the ground. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake, that they were at the wrong grave. My second thought was anger, a hot flash of possessive fury. This was my space, my time with my daughter, my private grief. Who dared intrude on this sacred moment? I walked faster, my heart pounding, ready to ask this person to leave. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an adult. It was a child, a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He was kneeling at Sarah's grave, and in his small hands, he held a single white rose. I stopped a few feet away, confused and suddenly uncertain. The boy hadn't noticed me yet. He was whispering something, words too soft for me to hear, and then he placed the rose carefully next to the headstone, right where I usually put my flowers. His small fingers traced Sarah's name carved into the stone, and I saw his shoulders shake. This child was crying. At my daughter's grave. A daughter he couldn't possibly have known, because Sarah had been gone for 3 years, and this boy was far too young to have been part of her adult life, unless something wasn't adding up. My anger evaporated, replaced by a profound confusion and a curiosity so intense it made my chest tight. I cleared my throat gently, not wanting to startle him. The boy jumped anyway, spinning around with wide, terrified eyes. They were brown, deep, and expressive, with long lashes wet with tears. He looked at me like a deer caught in headlights, frozen, clearly trying to decide whether to run or stay. His face was pale, smudged with dirt, and there was a bruise on his cheek that made something protective and furious rise up in me. Before I could speak, before I could ask him who he was or what he was doing here, he whispered 2 words that made my entire world tilt on its axis. He said, looking directly at me with those tear-filled eyes, he said, "I'm sorry. Not just sorry, but deeply, profoundly apologetic, as if he'd committed some terrible crime by being there." His voice was small and scared, and so heartbreakingly young. I knelt down, ignoring the protest of my 62-year-old knees, getting down to his level. Up close, I could see more details. The boy was thin, too thin, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under his eyes that no child should have. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places, clearly hand-me-downs that didn't quite fit. But his eyes, those eyes held something that made my heart ache. They held grief, real deep grief that mirrored my own. "What could a child this young know about loss?" I asked him, as gently as I could. "Who are you, son?" He flinched at the word son, and I saw him swallow hard before answering. His voice was barely a whisper. "My name is Lucas." Lucas. I turned the name over in my mind, searching my memory for any mention of a Lucas in Sarah's life, any connection, any story she'd told. Nothing. I'd thought I knew everything about my daughter, every friend, every classmate, every person who'd touched her life. But this child standing before me was a complete mystery. I asked him how he knew Sarah, and he looked down at his feet, scuffing his worn sneakers against the grass. For a long moment, I didn't think he would answer. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear him, he said, "She was my mama's friend. My mama's friend. Not his friend, but his mother's friend. Another piece of the puzzle, but one that didn't quite fit yet. I asked him where his mama was, why she wasn't here with him. Lucas's face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. He said, "Mama's gone too. Like Miss Sarah. She's in heaven now." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. This poor child had lost his mother, was grieving just as I was grieving, and somehow Sarah was connected to his loss. I reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort him, but he stepped back, still wary, still scared. I could see the internal struggle playing out on his young face, the desire for comfort warring with what looked like trained caution. Someone had taught this boy to be afraid of adults, to keep his distance, to protect himself. The thought made me sick. I sat back on my heels and tried a different approach. I told him my name was Richard, but everyone called me Rick. I told him that Sarah was my daughter, and that I missed her every single day. I told him I came here every Sunday to talk to her, to feel close to her, to remember. As I spoke, I saw Lucas's shoulders relax slightly, saw some of the fear leave his eyes. He asked me, "Do you really talk to her?" And there was such hope in his voice, such desperate need to believe that our loved ones could somehow still hear us. I nodded and said yes, I did, because even though I didn't know if she could hear me, it made me feel better to believe she could. It made the grief a little more bearable. We sat there together for a while, this strange child and I, in front of my daughter's grave in the early morning mist. I asked him more questions, gentle probing questions, trying to understand this connection I'd never known existed. Lucas told me that his mother, Maria, had worked with Sarah at a small nonprofit downtown. Something about helping homeless families find housing. I vaguely remembered Sarah mentioning a Maria, but she'd mentioned lots of names from work, and I'd never paid close enough attention. God, how I regretted that now. How many details of her life had I missed because I'd been too busy, too preoccupied with my own concerns, too confident that there would always be more time to ask questions and really listen to the answers? Lucas told me that his mother had been sick for a long time, cancer that had eaten away at her until there was nothing left but pain and goodbye. Sarah had visited them often, had brought groceries and helped pay bills, and spent time with Lucas when Maria was too weak to care for him. Sarah had been there, present and caring, and I'd known nothing about it. The realization was both heartwarming and devastating. Heartwarming because it confirmed what I'd always believed about my daughter, that she had a generous heart and a fierce commitment to helping others. Devastating because I'd missed it entirely, had been so wrapped up in my own life that I'd failed to see this whole other world she'd been involved in. Lucas said that after Maria died 6 months ago, he'd been placed in foster care. The way he said foster care made it clear it wasn't a good situation. He wouldn't elaborate, but I could fill in the blanks from the bruise on his face, from the fear in his eyes, from the way he'd flinched when I'd reached toward him. My heart was breaking for this child, this small person who'd lost so much and seemed to have no one fighting for him. I asked him how he got to the cemetery, and he looked away, ashamed. He said he'd snuck out early this morning while his foster parents were still asleep, had walked the 3 miles from their house to here because today would have been his mama's birthday, and he needed to visit Miss Sarah because Miss Sarah had promised his mama she'd watch over him. The pieces were finally starting to come together, forming a picture I'd never imagined. My daughter, in her final months, had made a promise to a dying woman to look after her son, and then Sarah herself had died, leaving Lucas alone and unprotected. The weight of that broken promise, through no fault of Sarah's own, pressed down on me like a physical thing. I looked at this boy, really looked at him, and saw not just grief and fear but also resilience and hope struggling to survive. I made a decision in that moment, standing in a cemetery with a child I'd just met, a decision that would change both our lives forever. I told Lucas that I wanted to help him, that I thought Sarah would want me to help him, that maybe we could help each other through our grief. He looked at me with such cautious hope that it nearly broke me. He asked, "Really?" And I said yes. Really. I asked him for his foster parents' names and address, told him I was going to look into his situation, see what could be done. Lucas seemed torn between hope and despair, wanting to believe but afraid to trust. Before he could respond, we heard a car pull up in the parking area. Lucas's eyes went wide with panic. He said, "I have to go. They'll be so angry if they know I left." He started to run, but I called after him. "Lucas, wait. Come back next Sunday, same time. I'll be here." He paused, looked back at me and nodded quickly before disappearing into the morning mist like a ghost. I stood there for a long time after he'd gone, staring at the white rose he'd left on Sarah's grave next to my sunflowers. My mind was reeling, my heart was pounding, and I felt more alive than I had in 3 years. Because suddenly, my grief had a purpose. Suddenly, there was something I could do, someone I could help, a way to honor Sarah's memory that went beyond talking to a headstone. I picked up my phone and called my wife Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. It was still early on a Sunday morning after all. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. About Lucas, about Maria, about Sarah's secret promise, about the bruise and the fear and the desperate need in this child's eyes. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Rick, we can't save every child in the foster system. We can't fix this." But I heard something else in her voice, something that suggested she wanted to try anyway. I said, "I know we can't save everyone, but maybe we can save this one." Sarah would have wanted us to try. Margaret sighed, but it wasn't a sound of defeat. It was a sound of acceptance of a woman who'd been married to me for 38 years and knew when I'd made up my mind about something. She said, "Okay, what do we need to do?" Those words, that simple question, they opened a door I'd thought was permanently closed, the door to a future that held something other than grief and emptiness and endless Sundays at a cemetery. I didn't know it then, standing there with Margaret on the phone and Lucas's white rose at my feet, but I was about to embark on the most challenging, frustrating, heartbreaking, and ultimately rewarding journey of my life. Have you ever felt completely lost, drowning in grief so deep you couldn't imagine ever finding your way back to the surface? That's where I was before Lucas appeared at Sarah's grave. I'd been going through the motions of living without actually being alive, existing in a gray world where nothing mattered because the person who'd mattered most was gone. Sarah had been our only child, our miracle baby after years of trying and fertility treatments and prayers that had finally been answered. From the moment she was born, with her tiny fingers wrapped around mine and her bright blue eyes staring up at me, I'd known that my purpose in life was to protect her, to guide her, to love her unconditionally. I'd done my best, or so I'd thought. I'd worked hard to provide for our family, had coached her soccer team when she was 8, had helped her with her homework, had walked her down the aisle at her wedding to Tom when she was 25. I'd thought we had time, decades of time to build more memories and share more moments. But cancer doesn't care about your plans or your assumptions about the future. Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer at 28 years old, 3 years into her marriage, just as she and Tom were starting to talk about having children of their own. The doctors gave her 2 years with treatment, maybe less without it. She chose to fight, underwent surgery and chemotherapy and radiation, spent months sick and weak and in pain. Margaret and I were there for everything, every appointment, every treatment, every middle-of-the-night phone call when the nausea was too much or the fear was too overwhelming. We watched our vibrant, beautiful daughter waste away, watched her hair fall out, and her skin turn gray, and her eyes lose their light. And through it all, Sarah remained kind and concerned about others, always thinking about someone else's problems even as her own body betrayed her. That's who she was, fundamentally and completely. She lasted 18 months. 18 months of fighting and hoping and trying experimental treatments that made her sicker, without making her better. At the end, we brought her home to our house, set up a hospital bed in the living room, and took turns sitting with her, holding her hand, telling her it was okay to let go. Tom was there too, broken and devastated, holding his wife's other hand as she slipped away from us. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with sunshine streaming through the windows and birds singing outside, nature completely indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in our living room. The funeral was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, co-workers and friends and neighbors and people I'd never met before. They all had stories about Sarah's kindness, her generosity, her commitment to helping others. I listened to them talk about my daughter and realized how little I'd actually known about her adult life, how much she'd kept private, how she'd grown into a person with her own world that existed separately from our family. After she died, Tom eventually moved away, unable to bear staying in a city full of memories of Sarah. He remarried 2 years later, and I didn't blame him. He was young and deserved a chance at happiness again. Margaret and I tried to rebuild our lives, tried to find a new normal, but the grief was always there, a constant companion that colored everything gray. We went to a grief support group for a while, but sitting in a circle talking about our feelings with strangers felt hollow and performative. We eventually stopped going. I retired from my job at the insurance company, couldn't focus on policies and claims when my daughter was dead and buried. Margaret kept working as a librarian, said the routine helped her cope, gave her a reason to get out of bed in the morning. I had nothing. No job, no purpose, no direction. Just endless empty days and Sunday mornings at the cemetery. That's where I was when Lucas walked into my life. Or rather, when I walked into his. That first Sunday after meeting him, I went home and started researching. I looked up Sarah's old nonprofit where Maria had worked, contacted people there, asked questions about Lucas's situation. What I learned made my blood boil. Maria had died intestate, with no family to take Lucas in. The boy had been placed in the foster care system, specifically with a couple named the Hendersons, who had a reputation for taking in multiple foster children primarily for the monthly stipend the state provided. The social worker I spoke with, a tired-sounding woman named Janet, was sympathetic but blunt. She told me the system was overwhelmed, underfunded, and understaffed. There were too many kids and not enough good homes. The Hendersons weren't the worst placement she'd seen, but they certainly weren't the best. When I asked about the bruise on Lucas's face, Janet sighed and said she'd look into it. But these things took time, and there had to be substantial evidence of abuse before a child could be removed from a home. I asked what would happen to Lucas, what his future looked like, and Janet's answer was depressing. He'd likely age out of the foster system at 18 without ever finding a permanent home, would probably struggle with attachment issues and trust issues, would statistically be at higher risk for homelessness, substance abuse, and incarceration. Statistics. That's what this woman was giving me. Cold numbers that reduced Lucas's life to probabilities and percentages. I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't accept that. I asked Janet what options existed for someone who wanted to help Lucas specifically, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Are you asking about becoming a foster parent or about adoption?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications and possibilities and the weight of commitment. I was 62 years old, recently retired, still deep in grief over losing my daughter. Was I really considering taking in a child? Starting over with the responsibility of raising another person? Margaret and I had already raised our child. We'd done our time with sleepless nights and school projects and teenage drama. We were supposed to be entering the relaxing phase of our lives, traveling and enjoying our retirement and maybe spoiling grandchildren if Sarah had lived long enough to give us any. But those plans were dead, buried with Sarah. And here was this child, this boy who'd loved my daughter and been loved by her in return, who needed someone to fight for him, to protect him, to give him the chance at life that Sarah would have wanted him to have. I told Janet I needed to discuss it with my wife, but yes, I was seriously considering it. She gave me information about the process, about background checks and home studies and court appearances and the long bureaucratic nightmare that was the foster care system. It seemed designed to discourage people from helping, to make the process so difficult and invasive that only the most determined would make it through. But I'd survived watching my daughter die. I could survive some paperwork and interviews. That night I sat down with Margaret at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals as a family, where Sarah had done her homework and planned her wedding, and later where she'd sat with us and told us about her diagnosis. I laid out everything I'd learned, everything I was thinking, and then I waited for Margaret's response. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching my face for something. Then she said, "Rick, are you trying to replace Sarah?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Was I? Was this some desperate attempt to fill the Sarah-shaped hole in my life with another child, to somehow undo the loss by saving someone she'd cared about? I thought about it, really thought about it, examining my motivations with brutal honesty. Finally, I said, no, I can't replace Sarah. Nothing and no one can ever replace her. But I think Sarah's death broke something fundamental in me, made me realize how fragile and precious life is, how we don't get unlimited time to do the things that matter. Lucas needs help right now, today, and I'm in a position to give it. Sarah would want me to help him. And honestly, Margaret, I need this. I need to feel like I'm doing something that matters, something that honors her memory in a real, tangible way. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take my hand. She said, "It's going to be hard. He's going to have trauma and trust issues and behavioral problems. We're not young anymore, Rick. We don't have the energy we had when we were raising Sarah. I squeezed her hand and said, I know, but we have something we didn't have then. We have experience and patience and the knowledge that time is precious, and you don't waste it on things that don't matter. We have love to give, and Lucas desperately needs love. Margaret nodded slowly, and I saw the exact moment she made her decision. I saw her grief transform into purpose, saw her shoulders straighten, and her jaw set with determination. She said, Okay, let's bring our grandson home. Grandson. The word settled over me like a blessing. Lucas wasn't Sarah's biological child, wasn't related to us by blood, but he was connected to us through love and loss and a promise made to a dying mother. If Sarah had lived, she would have been Lucas's guardian. In a way, by taking him in, we were completing the task she'd started. Fulfilling the obligation she'd accepted before her own death had made it impossible. The next Sunday, I was at the cemetery before sunrise, sitting by Sarah's grave and waiting. The morning was cold, frost coating the grass and my breath making clouds in the air. I'd brought hot chocolate in a thermos, hoping Lucas would show up, praying he'd be able to sneak out again without getting caught. At 7 o'clock, just as the sun was beginning to paint the sky pink and gold, I saw him. Lucas was walking up the path, moving quickly but carefully, his head swiveling around as if checking for observers. When he saw me, his face broke into a tentative smile that transformed his whole appearance, made him look like the child he should have been instead of the haunted, fearful boy I'd met the week before. He approached slowly, still cautious, and I held out the cup of hot chocolate. Lucas's eyes widened and he took it with both hands, wrapping his thin fingers around the warm cup. He whispered, "Thank you," and took a sip, and the expression of pure pleasure on his face made my heart ache. How long had it been since someone had done something kind for this child without expecting anything in return? I told Lucas that I'd been thinking about him all week, that I'd made some phone calls and done some research. I told him that I wanted to help him, that my wife Margaret and I wanted to see if maybe he could come live with us if he wanted that. I watched Lucas process this information, saw hope and disbelief and fear chase each other across his young face. He said, "Why would you want me?" And the question was so heartbreaking, so revealing of how little this child valued himself, that I had to take a moment to compose myself before answering. I said, "Because Sarah cared about you, and anything Sarah cared about matters to me. Because you're a good kid who deserves better than what you've got. Because Margaret and I have a lot of love, and nowhere to put it since Sarah died, and maybe we can help each other." Lucas was quiet for a long time, staring at the grave, at his mother's white rose that was wilted now but still there where he'd placed it the week before. Then he asked, "What if they won't let me go? What if the Hendersons say no?" I'd thought about this, had discussed it with Janet, the social worker. The truth was complicated and uncertain, full of legal processes and requirements that would take months to navigate. But I didn't want to discourage Lucas with talk of court battles and home studies. Instead, I said, "Then I'll fight for you. I'll do whatever it takes, fill out whatever forms, talk to whoever I need to talk to. I promise you, Lucas, I'm not giving up." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw him measuring my words, testing their weight, trying to decide if he could believe them. Finally, he asked, "Can I call you Grandpa?" And my heart, my broken, grieving heart that I'd thought was permanently damaged, it swelled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Joy mixed with sorrow, hope tinged with fear, love complicated by the absence of the person who should have been there to see this moment. I said, "I would be honored if you called me Grandpa." Lucas smiled, a real genuine smile that lit up his whole face. And in that moment, sitting in a cemetery at sunrise with this child I'd known for exactly 1 week, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. I felt hope. The journey from that moment to today wasn't easy or straightforward. It was filled with obstacles and setbacks and moments when I wanted to give up, when the system seemed designed to prevent me from helping this child who so desperately needed help. Have you ever tried to navigate bureaucracy when you're motivated by love and desperation? Have you ever felt like the rules and regulations exist to protect the system rather than the people the system is supposed to serve? That's exactly what it felt like trying to become Lucas's legal guardian. The process started with background checks. Extensive invasive background checks that examined every aspect of Margaret's and my lives. They looked at our finances, our criminal records, our medical histories, our employment records. They interviewed our neighbors, our friends, people from our church. They wanted to know about Sarah's death, wanted to make sure we weren't just trying to replace our deceased daughter with a new child as some kind of unhealthy coping mechanism. The intrusion was exhausting and often felt insulting, but I understood the necessity. The system had to protect children from people who might harm them, and the only way to do that was thorough vetting. We passed all the background checks easily. Margaret and I had lived quiet, law-abiding lives. We had stable finances, a house that was paid off, no criminal records, good health for our ages. On paper, we were ideal candidates to foster a child, but there were other complications, obstacles I hadn't anticipated. The Hendersons, Lucas's foster parents, objected to the removal of Lucas from their home. They claimed he was doing well with them, that disrupting his placement would be harmful, that they'd grown attached to him. The cynical part of me knew they were objecting because they'd lose the monthly stipend they received for caring for him. But I couldn't prove that, and it didn't matter legally. Their objection meant more paperwork, more court appearances, more delays. Meanwhile, Lucas was still living with them, and the situation seemed to be deteriorating. The second Sunday after our conversation about me becoming his grandpa, Lucas showed up at the cemetery with a black eye, swollen and purple, that he tried to hide under a baseball cap pulled low. When I asked what happened, he gave me an obviously rehearsed story about tripping and hitting a doorframe. But his eyes couldn't quite meet mine, and his hands were shaking when he took the hot chocolate I'd brought for him. I was furious, ready to storm over to the Hendersons' house and demand answers. But Janet, the social worker, warned me that aggressive action on my part could actually hurt our case. She needed to document the abuse properly, needed to build a case that would stand up in court. So I had to be patient, had to trust the process, even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to protect this child immediately. It was torture, seeing Lucas with bruises and cuts, knowing he was going back to a home where he wasn't safe, where he wasn't loved, where he was just a source of income. Those weeks turned into months. The home study for our house took forever, required modifications like installing smoke detectors in specific locations and child-proofing cabinets. Even though Lucas was old enough to know not to drink drain cleaner, we had to take classes on foster parenting, sit through sessions about trauma-informed care and attachment theory and behavioral management strategies. Some of it was genuinely useful, information I wished I'd had when raising Sarah, but much of it felt like box-checking, bureaucratic requirements that existed to justify the existence of the bureaucracy itself. Through it all, Lucas and I maintained our Sunday morning meetings at the cemetery. They became the highlight of my week, these quiet conversations with a child who was gradually opening up to me, trusting me with pieces of his story, sharing his fears and hopes and dreams. He told me about his mother, about how she'd been the best mom in the world before she got sick, how she'd made the best pancakes and sang silly songs and always made him feel safe and loved. He cried when he talked about watching her die, about being in the hospice room at the end, about how she'd made him promise to be brave and to remember that she'd always love him no matter where she was. He told me about Sarah, about how Miss Sarah had been like a fairy godmother, showing up with presents and taking him to the park and reading him stories when his mom was too weak to do it herself. He said Sarah had promised him that everything would be okay, that she'd make sure he was taken care of, and then she'd gotten sick too and died, and he'd thought maybe the promise was broken. Maybe he was destined to lose everyone who cared about him. Hearing this, understanding the depth of loss this 8-year-old child had experienced, it broke something in me and simultaneously strengthened my resolve. Lucas needed stability, needed love, needed someone to show him that not everyone leaves, not everyone dies, not every promise gets broken. I told him about Sarah's childhood, stories he'd never heard about her, about how she'd been obsessed with dinosaurs when she was 5, could name every species and insisted on being a paleontologist for Halloween, about how she'd been terrified of thunderstorms until she was 10, would climb into bed between Margaret and me whenever thunder rumbled, about her first day of high school when she'd been so nervous she'd thrown up in the car and we'd had to turn around and get her a new outfit. Lucas listened to these stories with intense focus, as if he was memorizing every detail, building a more complete picture of the woman who'd been so important to his mother and to him. He started bringing his own stories to share, memories of times with Sarah that I'd never known about, like when Sarah had taken him to the zoo and they'd spent 3 hours watching the penguins because they were his favorite, or when she'd helped him with a school project about space, and they'd built a model solar system with styrofoam balls and coat hangers, or the time she'd brought him a stuffed dog when his mom was in the hospital and he'd been scared and alone, and he'd slept with that dog every night since. These Sunday mornings became sacred to both of us, a bridge between past and present, between loss and hope, between the family we'd lost and the family we were trying to build. But they were also dangerous for Lucas. The Hendersons eventually noticed his Sunday absences and punished him for it, grounding him and taking away privileges and, I suspected though I couldn't prove, physically hurting him. Lucas started showing up with more injuries, more bruises, more fear in his eyes. I documented everything with photos on my phone, wrote down dates and descriptions, built a case even as I felt sick doing it because it felt exploitative to photograph this child's pain. But Janet said it was necessary, that we needed evidence, and she was finally building a case for removal. Then came the court hearing. Margaret and I dressed in our best clothes, hired a lawyer named Patricia Chen, who specialized in foster care cases, and sat in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and anxiety. The Hendersons were there with their lawyer, a sharp-faced woman who argued that removing Lucas would be traumatic, that he needed stability and consistency, that my wife and I were too old and too inexperienced with foster care to handle a child with Lucas's level of trauma. She painted us as well-meaning but naive, suggested we were using Lucas to fill the void left by Sarah's death, implied that our motivations were selfish rather than altruistic. It took everything I had not to stand up and shout at her, to defend our motives and our capacity to love this child. But Patricia had warned us to stay quiet, to let her handle it, to trust the process. The judge, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes, listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence of Lucas's injuries, reviewed our home study and background checks and character references. Then she asked to speak to Lucas privately, in chambers, away from all the adults who were fighting over his future. I don't know what Lucas told her in that room, what questions she asked or how he answered, but when they came out 30 minutes later, the judge had made her decision. Lucas was being removed from the Hendersons' care immediately and placed in our temporary custody pending the completion of the foster care certification process. Lucas could come home with us today, right now, as soon as the paperwork was filed. I looked at Margaret and saw tears streaming down her face, saw relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. I looked at Lucas and saw him standing very still, like he was afraid to move, afraid that any action on his part might break this fragile moment and take away the good thing that was happening. I stood up and walked over to him, ignoring the lawyers and the judge and everyone else in the courtroom. I knelt down to his level and said, "Lucas, do you want to come home with Margaret and me?" He nodded, unable to speak, tears running down his cheeks. I said, "Then let's go home, grandson." That word, grandson, it made everything real. This wasn't just a foster placement or a charitable act. This was family. We were becoming family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the ghost of a daughter and friend who'd brought us together. The first weeks with Lucas in our home were both wonderful and challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The wonderful parts were obvious. Having a child in the house again, hearing laughter and footsteps and questions being asked, it brought life back to a space that had felt like a mausoleum since Sarah's death. Lucas was curious about everything, wanted to explore every room, asked about photos on the walls and books on shelves and the stories behind our possessions. He was particularly fascinated by Sarah's old room, which we'd kept largely unchanged since her death. We'd boxed up some things after she died, but had left her books and her collection of ceramic horses and her graduation cap hanging from the bedpost. Lucas would stand in the doorway sometimes, just looking, not entering because I think he felt like he'd be intruding on sacred space. One day, I found him there and invited him in. I showed him Sarah's favorite books, told him about her horse phase when she was 12 and insisted she wanted to be a veterinarian. I showed him her yearbooks, pictures of her in the drama club and on the soccer field, evidence of a full life before cancer had stolen it. Lucas listened to every word, absorbing the information like it was precious. And then he asked if maybe one day this could be his room. The question took me by surprise, and I saw immediately that Lucas regretted asking, thought maybe he'd overstepped. But I said yes, absolutely. This could be his room. We'd need to pack up some of Sarah's things, keep them somewhere safe. But this house was his house now, and he should have his own space. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, pure and joyful and full of hope. But there were challenges too. Difficulties I hadn't fully prepared for despite all the training classes. Lucas had nightmares almost every night, would wake up screaming about his mother or about things that happened in foster care that he wouldn't talk about during the day. He had trust issues, would hoard food in his room because he'd been food insecure before, would hide his favorite things because he expected them to be taken away. He had trouble at school, had fallen behind academically because he'd moved so many times, had behavioral problems because he didn't know how to ask for help and would lash out instead. Margaret and I had to learn patience on a level we'd never practiced before. We had to learn when to push and when to back off, when to enforce rules and when to let things slide, when to comfort and when to give space. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and there were moments when I wondered if we'd made a terrible mistake, if we were too old for this, if we didn't have what Lucas needed. But then there would be a breakthrough moment that made everything worthwhile. Like the night Lucas came into our bedroom during a thunderstorm, scared and shaking, and asked if he could sleep between us like Sarah used to do. We said yes, and he climbed into our bed, small and vulnerable, and fell asleep holding Margaret's hand. Or the day he brought home a school project where he'd been asked to draw his family, and he'd drawn the three of us, plus an angel with wings labeled Sarah and Mama Maria watching over us. Or the first time he told us he loved us without being prompted, just said it spontaneously over breakfast one morning, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Our extended family's reaction to Lucas was mixed and sometimes painful. My brother thought we were crazy, too old to be raising a child, setting ourselves up for heartbreak. Margaret's sister was more supportive but worried about the financial burden, about our health, about what would happen to Lucas if something happened to us. Some friends from church were wonderful, brought casseroles and offered to babysit and treated Lucas like he'd always been part of our family. Others were more distant, seemed uncomfortable with the situation, perhaps wondering about our motives or simply not knowing how to relate to our new reality. The worst was dealing with some of Sarah's old friends, people who'd known her and mourned her, and now seemed to think we were somehow betraying her memory by moving forward with our lives. One woman actually said to my face that she thought it was inappropriate for us to be replacing Sarah with a foster child, as if Lucas was some kind of cheap substitute for our daughter. I'd never been so angry in my life, wanted to shake this woman and make her understand that love doesn't work that way, that the heart's capacity for love is infinite, that loving Lucas didn't mean we loved Sarah any less. Margaret had to physically pull me away before I said something I'd regret, but mostly people were kind. People saw a child who needed a home and grandparents who had love to give, and they supported us however they could. Tom, Sarah's widower, reached out after hearing about Lucas. He said Sarah had mentioned Maria and Lucas to him, that she'd been trying to figure out how to help them before she got too sick to follow through. He said he thought Sarah would be happy knowing we'd completed the work she'd started, and hearing that from him meant more than I could express. The legal process to finalize Lucas's adoption took another year of paperwork and court appearances and social worker visits. By the time we stood in front of a judge for the final hearing, Lucas had been living with us for 14 months. He'd gone from a scared, traumatized 8-year-old to a more confident, happier 9-year-old who was thriving in school and had made friends and was starting to believe that this good thing in his life wasn't going to be taken away. The judge asked Lucas if he wanted to be legally adopted by us, if he wanted us to be his grandparents permanently, forever. Lucas stood up straight and said in a clear voice, "Yes, Your Honor. I want Rick and Margaret to be my grandparents. They love me and I love them and we're a family." The judge smiled and signed the papers, and just like that, Lucas Morrison became our legal grandson, carrying Sarah's last name, connected to her officially and permanently. We celebrated with ice cream and a movie, nothing fancy because Lucas still wasn't entirely comfortable with being the center of attention. But that night, after he'd gone to bed, Margaret and I sat on our back porch and cried. We cried for Sarah, for the grandchildren she never got to give us, for the life she should have had. We cried for Maria, a woman we'd never met but who'd raised an incredible child and had trusted our daughter to protect him. We cried for Lucas and everything he'd lost and everything he'd endured, and we cried from relief and gratitude that somehow, out of all that loss and pain, we'd found each other and built something beautiful. Today, Lucas is 12 years old. He's taller now, starting to lose that little kid look and grow into the young man he'll become. He still has nightmares sometimes, still has moments when the trauma surfaces and he needs extra reassurance and comfort. But he's also happy, genuinely happy, in a way that seemed impossible 3 years ago. He plays soccer, the same sport Sarah loved, and he's actually pretty good at it. He's in the school band learning to play trumpet, makes sounds that could charitably be called music and more accurately be called noise, but he practices every day and he's improving. He has friends who come over for sleepovers and video games, normal kid activities that fill our house with chaos and laughter. Every Sunday morning, the three of us go to the cemetery together. We bring flowers for Sarah and for Maria, whose grave is in a different section of the same cemetery. Lucas has stopped crying every time we visit, though he still gets quiet and thoughtful, still talks to his mama and to Miss Sarah about what's happening in his life. He tells them about his grades and his soccer games, and the girl at school he thinks is cute but is too shy to talk to. And I stand there listening to my grandson talk to my daughter, and I feel a complicated mix of emotions that I've learned to accept. Sadness and joy, grief and gratitude, loss and love, all tangled together in a way that can't be separated. Lucas calls me Grandpa and Margaret Grandma, though sometimes when he's feeling particularly affectionate, he calls us Gramps and Grammy. He knows about his biological grandparents on Maria's side, who died before he was born, and he understands that family can be both biological and chosen. He knows that we're his family by choice, that we chose him as much as he chose us, and that choice makes the bond even stronger rather than weaker. People sometimes ask if I ever regret the decision to take in Lucas, if the burden of raising a child in my 60s is too much, if I wish I could have the peaceful retirement I'd planned. The answer is complicated but ultimately simple. Yes, it's hard. Yes, I'm tired sometimes in ways I wasn't when I was younger. Yes, there are moments of frustration and difficulty that make me long for the quiet simplicity of life before Lucas. But regret? Never. Not for a single second. Because Lucas saved me just as much as I saved him. When Sarah died, I thought my purpose in life had died with her. I thought I was just marking time until my own death, existing without really living, going through motions without meaning. Lucas gave me back my purpose. He gave me a reason to get up in the morning, someone to care for, someone who needed me not for what I could provide materially, but for the love and stability and guidance only a parent figure can give. He reminded me that life continues even after devastating loss, that joy can coexist with grief, that the heart's capacity to love is not diminished by death, but can actually grow in response to it. And in saving Lucas and giving him the home and family he deserved, I feel like I'm honoring Sarah's memory in the most meaningful way possible. I'm completing the promise she made to Maria, fulfilling the obligation she accepted before cancer made it impossible for her to follow through. Every time Lucas laughs or succeeds at something or shows kindness to another person, I see Sarah's influence, the ripple effect of her compassion and generosity extending beyond her death through this child she helped and the grandparents who adopted him. So yes, I found a stranger at my daughter's grave 3 years ago, a small, scared child with tears in his eyes and a white rose in his hands, and a connection to Sarah I'd never known existed. That stranger now calls me Grandpa, and it's one of the greatest joys of my life. Through the grief and the bureaucracy and the challenges and the uncertainty, we found each other and built a family from the broken pieces of our hearts. We learned that love doesn't replace loss but can exist alongside it, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting those we've lost but can actually honor their memory more fully than staying frozen in grief. I think about Sarah every day, miss her every day, wish she was here to see what's become of Lucas and how he's grown. But I also believe in whatever way consciousness survives death, that she knows. She knows we kept her promise, that we took care of the child she loved, that her death wasn't the end of her impact on the world but was actually the beginning of something new and beautiful. Have you ever experienced a loss so profound you thought you'd never recover? Have you ever found unexpected blessing growing from grief, hope emerging from heartbreak? That's been my journey. The path from that first Sunday morning when I found a crying child at my daughter's grave to today, when that child is my grandson and my reason for living. Lucas asks sometimes why we chose him, why we went through so much trouble and difficulty to make him part of our family. The question always catches at my heart because the answer is so simple and so profound. We chose him because Sarah loved him, and we love Sarah. We chose him because he needed us, and we needed him, because grief had left us all broken, and somehow our broken pieces fit together to make something whole. We chose him because family isn't just about biology. It's about love and commitment, and showing up day after day to support each other through good times and bad. We chose him because when you have the capacity to help someone, especially a child who desperately needs help, choosing not to act is its own decision and not one we could live with. As I watch Lucas grow and thrive and become the person he's meant to be, I feel grateful beyond words for that morning 3 years ago. Grateful that Lucas found his way to Sarah's grave, that our paths crossed, that I had the courage to reach out instead of walking away. Grateful for Margaret's willingness to embark on this journey with me, for her patience and love and strength through all the challenges. Grateful for the social workers and lawyers and teachers and friends who supported us and helped make this family possible. So to anyone reading this, anyone who's ever stood at a loved one's grave feeling like your life is over, anyone who's ever encountered someone in need and wondered if you should help, anyone who's ever questioned whether moving forward means betraying those you've lost, I want you to know this. Love doesn't end with death. Purpose can be found even in the deepest grief. Family can be chosen as well as given. And sometimes, the most important things we do in life are the things that scare us most. The commitments that seem too difficult. The paths that appear too hard to walk. 3 years ago, I was a broken man talking to a gravestone, living in the past, unable to imagine a future that held anything but loss. Today, I'm grandpa to an incredible boy who makes me laugh and drives me crazy and fills my heart with love I didn't think I was capable of feeling again. I'm part of a family that was built from tragedy but is defined by love. I'm living proof that life can surprise you, that good can come from grief, that the darkest moments can lead to unexpected light. If you've made it this way through my story, if you've listened to this old man ramble about loss and love and the grandson who saved him, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been through a loss that changed everything? Have you ever found hope in the most unexpected place? I'd love to hear your story, your experience, your journey through grief and back to life. Share it in the comments below, because these stories matter, these connections matter, these reminders that we're not alone in our pain and our healing. They matter more than you might think. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of something important or gave you hope or simply made you feel something real, please leave a like. It helps this channel reach more people who might need to hear this message, who might be sitting at a gravestone themselves wondering if life will ever feel meaningful again. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories like this. Real stories about real people navigating loss and love, and the beautiful complexity of human existence. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos, because I'll keep sharing. Keep telling these stories, keep reminding us all that we're more resilient than we think, and more connected than we sometimes remember. Thank you for listening to my story, for letting me share this journey with you, for being part of this community of people who believe that stories matter, and that our experiences, even the painful ones, can help and inspire others. Lucas and I will keep visiting Sarah's grave every Sunday morning. We'll keep building our family. We'll keep moving forward while honoring the past. And we'll do it knowing that somewhere, somehow, Sarah and Maria are watching and smiling, seeing the good that came from their love and their sacrifice. Life is precious and fragile and full of unexpected turns. Don't waste it. Don't let fear stop you from helping someone who needs it. Don't let grief convince you that your purpose died with someone you loved. There's always more life to live, more love to give, more ways to make a difference. You just have to be brave enough to take that first step, to reach out your hand, to choose love over fear. That's what I learned from a stranger at my daughter's grave, a stranger who became my grandson and my second chance at life. That's the gift Sarah gave me through Lucas, the final lesson from a daughter who never stopped teaching me how to be better, how to love more, how to live with purpose and compassion. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, the best is yet to come, even when it seems impossible, especially when it seems impossible. Keep your heart open, keep choosing love, and you'll be amazed at what life brings you.